We begin this hour with the demolition of the federal infrastructure, while Republican leaders kind of look the other way. NBC News reports that the Trump administration has directed federal agencies to prepare for mass layoffs, according to heads of the White House Budget and Personnel Management offices. Meanwhile, some House Republicans who held town hall events were confronted by constituents outraged over the cuts to federal funding that the Department of Government Efficiency has instituted across agencies. Here's Speaker Mike Johnson on what he thinks the town hall anger is really all about.
No, because no, I don't. Because the videos you saw of the town halls were for paid protesters in many of those places. These are Democrats who went to the events early and filled up the seats. If the videos had panned outside the building, you can't argue
they were all paid protesters, though, Mr. Speaker.
Many of them were.
A Republican acknowledged they were his constituents.
One Republican acknowledged they were his constituents. That's fantastic. Okay, but they had Democrats come and fill the seats early.
The speaker added that the American people are behind what's happening, seemingly referring to Trump's legislative agenda and moves to lay off government workers. Really, Mr. Speaker? Because several recent polls show more Americans disapprove of Trump and Musk's effort to cut the federal workforce than approve. A recent Washington Post poll showed 54% disapprove of Trump's managing of the federal government, and more Americans disapprove of Musk than approve of him. Also today, a federal judge ordered the Office of Personnel Management to rescind its January 20 memo and February 14th internal email, where it told agencies to promptly determine whether these employees should be retained at the agency. The judge said it's illegal and should be stopped. Joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor and MSNBC political analyst Charles Blow and former Congressman David Jolly. Yamiche, this ongoing onslaught, if you will, against the federal government seems to go about unabated. What's the latest you're hearing with respect to plans for other agencies, particularly given the report just out a little while ago that federal Judge William Alsup has ordered OPM to rescind the memo calling on agencies to fire probationary employees?
Well, I think it's still really too early to understand what the exact implications and consequences of this judge's decision is going to be, because the judge is saying that people who have already lost their jobs, they're not getting rescinded. They're not getting those jobs back. And I think that that's something that a lot of people are watching. If it was illegal to fire those probationary employees and a number of other employees, it's a question of whether or not any of those people will be able to sue and get them back. The other big question here is whether or not this will end up in the Supreme Court, because we've seen the case of USAID, where we had a federal judge say, in fact, no, you should not be allowed to fire these people. And then the Supreme Court weighed in and said, actually, you can go forward. So I think that you really, in some ways, have to see how this plays out. I'm very interested to see whether or not this ends up in the Supreme Court. That being said, the Trump administration has been very clear that they're going to continue full speed ahead with cuts and trims. We just saw tonight 5% of NOAA, which, of course, deals with weather, all sorts of sort of scientific situations and issues in our country. They're having a reduction in force. The White House is saying that they're still going to be not letting go of people like meteorologists and other essential workers. But I think it's very interesting to see the White House even tonight announcing and making clear that they are making more cuts. So I think what we have here is a Trump administration that feels like they are able, through the executive branch, to continue to make these cuts. And let's remember, their goal is $2 trillion from the federal budget. So cutting people, agencies here and there, is not going to get you there. So this is going to be a lot bigger and a lot more widespread. We're only a month and a half into this.
You know, David, this sweeping hacksaw to the federal government without rhyme or reason, nor any regard for the people impacted. They talk about, wanting to keep essential personnel, but who's supporting the essential personnel they're keeping? They're the ones also being fired. You have Tammy Duckworth, particularly looking at the impact on our veterans. And she had this to say at a virtual event on the impact that DOGE is having, noting that she had invited Elon Musk to join her.
It's a middle finger to our heroes. It's a slap in the face to the sacrifices our veterans have made. It's BS frankly, and every one of us who has served should feel insulted. Donald Trump now has fired more veterans than any other president in recent history. How dare a 5-time draft-dodging coward turn his back on the men and women who, unlike him, actually were brave enough to serve our nation in uniform?
That impact on veterans seems to really be resonating across the country as more and more veterans are losing their jobs. How do you assess that as a piece of this overall effort?
Oh, a significant part, Michael. Listen, I think the first month of the Trump administration has been a colossal failure. This will be remembered for the war on the federal bureaucracy and the war on federal employees. And here's where it's kind of fascinating. As a top-line issue, most people would say, yes, we need fewer federal employees because perhaps there's a real disconnect between the services they actually receive and the federal employees they're talking about, or the ability of the VA to administer benefits, or the National Park Service to keep a park open. Unless you really can draw a line personally in your own home to the direct benefit, perhaps you say, sure, let's cut federal employees. But here's where they're way off. If you ask people what they actually care about tonight, cutting the federal workforce is probably number 30 on their list. Number 1 is the price of eggs. Number 2 is inflation. Number 3 is the job market. Number 4 is the affordability of healthcare, the access to higher education. And so this is one of those things where it might feel good for some, a very small part of the American voter, but it is way, way off message. And then you get to the real people who are impacted. I mean, the case tonight where the district judge in California issued the temporary restraining order on probationary employees. It's a group of 200,000 federal employees. Consider what that does to their livelihoods, to their communities. Consider what that does to the national unemployment rolls. And to Yamisha's point, with very little federal savings involved, they are way off message on this. And the last thing I would say, Michael, that sound you played from Mike Johnson, how demeaning for the speaker to say, oh, but these were just Democrats, as though Democrats are less worthy constituents to members of Congress than actual Republican constituents. Somehow, if you're a Democratic constituent, you don't have a right to voice your opinion to a member of Congress. That was a hot garbage moment from the speaker, but very revealing about how this first month is going.